decoding now?
It's often said that there are more than 6 centuries of English literature. It's not often said that there are less than 2 centuries of English literacy. Of course, English in those 2 sentences has different meanings. The first refers primarily to the language, the second to the people. But then it's the ordinarily unexamined relations between these meanings that can reveal a central problem in English studies.
Fine. Well, if I ask you the most verbose question first, which is, in culture, you describe theatrical signal within a general history of dramatic forms, and you comment on the fragility and the brevity of what we call the Shakespearean moment, implicated as it is in the rise of one of the first mass urban entertainments, which then breaks up. Could you outline this idea briefly and consider what its implications are for teaching Shakespeare?
The Shakespearean audience was not only very wide-ranging of different kinds of occupation and education, a wider social range than there has been until, I suppose, in different forms this century in cinema and television. It was also a very wide range in language, and this language not only among the audience, but this is the key thing for reading Shakespeare now, actually in the plays. Now, some of the signals are very much of Shakespeare's own time, the fact that it is open to the sky, that it's in ordinary daylight, and so on, that the audience is differently positioned in relation to the stage by comparison with our simple signals of the theatre going dark or some title and announcement. But it's much more than that. The signals are in the speech, and the key thing to try to discover in reading a Shakespeare play is what kind of speech is going on in what kind of relation to this very diverse audience at any particular point. For example, at times it is something very formal, as if on a platform, with people speaking the most formal language of the time. At another time, it is downstage, nearer to the audience, probably turned towards the audience and bring them in on it, very colloquial, the way the audience themselves would speak in the street. Now, those are 2 extremes of the range, but what often happens is that people see these lines on the page and read them as a flat text, not realizing that these signals of meaning, what kind of speech, what kind of relation to the audience is being given, are an essential part of the meaning of the play, not just how it should be produced, but the way the meaning of the play unfolds.
Yeah, one of the reasons for looking at the text in that flat, blank way is still, I think, because we tend to think of the author as a solitary writer.
Yeah.
And therefore it's a paradox. As you say, the Shakespearean text is very collaborative and multivocal and necessarily engaged with an audience. What do you think the implications of that paradox are for trying to teach Shakespeare nowadays?
Well, I think that we may be moving out of the period of the flat text, which came from a period in which print culture was so dominant and people got most of their experience of imaginative writing from the written page. But on the other hand, when people move to Shakespeare, they say, oh, Shakespeare, and put it back into that print culture. A lot of the teaching is going, as it were, line by line, reading through it. I think that the emphasis on the single author who's not taking part with a company of others in working out these effects, and moreover able to rely on other people knowing these movements and attitudes to the audience, which are the very material that Shakespeare's working with. I think that can be learned in a general way, but you only ever register it in your mind if you go through some particular part of a play and see how it's happening. To see, for example, the sudden shift from these very formal, romantic speeches in Troilus and Cressida back through the people watching. There's one case when you've got 3 levels going on, and the last level is a very straight, colloquial, skeptical, involving the audience, look at what they're doing, putting another point of view on the way they're behaving and talking. And yet that doesn't simply destroy these other people, like in a music hall sketch parodying Shakespeare, because back comes the formal speech. And so what you're seeing, this is the real meaning of multivocal, is not only that several different voices are contributing, but the different kinds of voice, different levels of voice, different levels of meaning, different values being drawn on. But once you've done a piece of a Shakespeare play, or preferably the whole play, in ways that you pick up those signals, now what's happening here, what's the relation to the audience, what's the level of the speech, then you get the sense, the only sense we can have of that audience, because of course we can't recreate that audience or its diversity, but we can realize that this is unusually open writing at several different levels, and we must above all not flatten it to one text that we call Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm. One other way in which the text might be flattened is to look at the individuals within the text as isolated figures. This still tends to happen. And one of the reasons for this is that one of the very first literary terms we all learn is soliloquy.
Yes.
I wonder if you could expand a little on this idea in terms of how we understand soliloquy. How should we understand it?
Soliloquy is a very difficult term, because it used simply to mean a sort of private prayer, private meditation. And of course there are some soliloquies in Shakespeare which are that, or they've been taught as that, and some of them really are that it's somebody thinking aloud. But of course if you remember that there's an audience there, this thinking aloud is not so easy an idea. You're thinking aloud in front of a large number of people. Now, if you go through the different kinds of things that are just put down as soliloquy, although the way they actually work is very different, you find that sometimes this is speaking to the audience, not having private inner speech which the audience happens to overhear, but actually speaking to the audience, in some cases deliberately sharing with them. You find, for example, that some soliloquies are I soliloquies, what is going on inside my mind. Some are we soliloquies, including some of the most famous, To Be or Not to Be, Tomorrow and Tomorrow, where the we is part of a relation which is including the audience in some general reflection on life. Now, if the general reflection on life is reduced to what just this isolated character happens to be thinking inside his mind, again a whole range of meaning is lost. And some is, of course, not thinking or this general inclusion, but a kind of interchange with the audience. Try this for an attitude on what's going on. It's very much meant to be open and interactive, so that if we reduce all these different kinds of monologue writing, that's to say, writing for someone who's either alone on the stage or can be taken to be alone on the stage for practical purposes, that every time this happens, it's somebody speaking to themselves, thinking to themselves, we miss, I would have thought, 3/4 of what this kind of writing actually can do.
Mm-hmm. The same kind of thing occurs even when we're dealing with very private conversations between two people.
Yes.
It's often difficult to read on the page, but even just in terms of the position, an exchange like the one between Emilia and Desdemona in Othello seems to me to move to a more collective form of address as Emilia finishes the scene immediately prior to the catastrophe.
That's one of the most astonishing things when you start reading the plays in this way, that there can be shifts from private, enclosed conversation to what is general and reaching out to the audience, in a sense offering to include them in some feeling, which now we would say are too difficult to make. People say, well, it's got to be one kind of play or another. But these shifts are happening. There must have been within that theatre, and this is the whole point, as you said, about him being collaborating with people who were highly trained to particular ways of doing this, and an audience which was used to these ways of doing it, of being able to shift level. The shift of level would now seem extremely daring. I mean, what happens in so many periods afterwards is a play either pitches itself at this very serious formal level, or at a very colloquial level, or at most to some hybrid between the two, whereas these are moving from one level to another within a scene, within a few lines. And the signals would be done in particular ways by Elizabethan actors, but if we understand them from the language, what sort of address and relationship is going on in this kind of writing, then I think we can find contemporary ways of doing that in our own terms.
Mm-hmm. I think what's interesting for me also is that at the level of the meaning of a speech like Amelia's, it does seem that the idea of equality, which clearly meant something very different for the Elizabethans and was in a process of change, is part of the subject matter there, so that this collective address is part of a concern with the notion of equality across these social divisions.
This deep feeling of a common condition which both overcame and yet in a way was put in the margin of the very big differences of social condition that were actually there in that audience. This is continually played on, this deep feeling of a common condition, which is not just what some of the textbooks say, that they all had the same faith, because to take the most famous general soliloquy, to be or not to be, it really has the form of a prayer. But curiously, it is a prayer which is not based on belief, but on uncertainty. And the common condition is often one of a very strong feeling of being in a common condition, but not yet fully of understanding it. It's full of uncertainty. And that kind of questioning was being shared. And that move to that level is always an indication so that these are some of the deepest questions that are being asked. This is beyond the diversity of the audience. You see, it is diverse, but although it can fragment at times for particular purposes, there are ways precisely of uniting at some level in some common condition, which is this response. That's why the Shakespearean moment is in a way so fragile, because that which is coexisting under great tension and with great questioning at that time has, after all, within 30, 40 years, become a condition of civil war. And the theatres from that time on are class separated in quite new ways, and those people are not in the same common condition. And it then separates out as one party against another. But here there's this continual probing towards the understanding of a common condition where people know that they know them is very important, but they're not really satisfied with them. They set up situations which shows that there are still questions, so that this open, questioning, different level, writing and speaking, it comes out of that moment.
I was wondering, this was one of the other questions I was thinking about. You've spoken in drama and in a dramatized society about the way for our audience nowadays, which is in very different ways fragmented, the sense of drama, a new sense of drama, pervades everyday life and becomes part of the way that we look at things like authority and what remains of a faith and the kinds of things that we can have faith in. I wondered, just off the cuff, whether you can see any kinds of connections between the period you've described and this modern period that we're in?
Well, at a simple level, first, there's an extraordinary continuity, a kind of surviving antique of English public life, that these processions of the majesty of the state are actually reenacted in much the same way on certain occasions. Even the opening of Parliament, the most democratic of occasions, theoretically, is accompanied by this extraordinary Tudor panoply of carriages and maces and walking backwards and so on, which belong to an absolutist state. It's very interesting that that should be so. The other signals, however, we've got to learn are more complicated ones, like the distinction in television between people who can address others on their own behalf, in their own right, what in the trade is called people with something to say, and what's called as an undiscriminated mass outside them, the public. So that what they call in the trade vox pop, you know, where a microphone is pushed in front of you and you can say what you like in answer to that question, but you can't speak on your own behalf or say the question I wish to put is this. Now, authority is set up in those ways, whether it's representatives, experts, you know, people in authority, continually offering to show people that there are in this trade jargon people with something to say, special people. The others, yes, they speak, but that vox pop jargon in the trade says it all. These are indiscriminate voices of the public. Like they say in the popular papers about readers' letters, you write. I mean, you've probably not written at all. I mean, it's very unlikely when you say you write that you've written a letter in that paper, but you isn't you, a person. You is the indiscriminate mass who are not the people producing the paper. Now, these are the modern ways of putting authority, and it's very comic sometimes to see them alongside this ritual reenactment of Tudor majesty with gold coaches and outriders and this conscious antique. It's not an accident, actually, that this antique ceremonial is done, as it were, to contain and define Parliament, just as then Parliament is used to contain and define active democratic decision. Which is, all these things happen. And in a way very similar to dramatic signals, because although they're based on differences of power, a lot of them are built in ways that people come to think are natural, you know, that these divisions are real, whereas most of them are produced.
I was thinking also of the way in which political events are produced for a particular convention and a particular kind of audience in things like 9 o'clock news, breakfast news.
Yes.
Could you comment on that?
Well, it's very interesting to me that the news is introduced with such extraordinarily bombastic music and titles. I mean, what is that a signal of? I mean, it is very obviously actually a signal of authority, but not of authority of fact or truth. It's authority of attention. These extraordinary 9 o'clock news messages from space, which come in and come out again, and then these godlike figures are seen against an aura. We're going to be telling you something. Of course, once they start to talk, you know perfectly well they're nothing of the kind, and what they're saying and reporting is so banal, and you're relieved when you get through them to seeing some actual people doing something, because then at least that is news. But still it goes on. Very fortunately there's good counter-movement, because one of the nicer sketches of that 9 o'clock news opening was these messages from space coming in and destroying the platform. And after all, if you're going to take the signal literally, that's what they would do. If these rays for space were coming into this magic platform, they would blow it up. Unfortunately, with all these signals of authority, as in the Elizabethan theatre, Shakespeare is aware of it all the time, there's a skepticism based on common sense, which is very active in that audience. And instead of being allowed to fester away in the margin, so to say, you know, not much taking to it. It is given a voice in the plays all the time. There's always some characters who are voicing, even sometimes in the coarsest ways, and this is often important, sheer skepticism about the professions and pretensions of these more important and elevated characters. And that interplay is a unique kind of thing.
Yeah. I'd like to just have a glass of water and ask Brian whether he feels there are any points he wants to pick up on from that. What we're actually going to be doing with this is...
Creates Rowan, so whenever you want.
It's often said that there are more than 6 centuries of English literature. It's not often said that there are less than 2 centuries of English literacy. Of course, English in those two statements means rather different things. The first refers to the language, the second to the people. But then it's the ordinarily unexamined relation between those two meanings, the language and the people, that can be a central problem in English studies. I did it without reading that time, so it's not quite according to the text.
We had what we were going to throw out.
Well, it was very nice you sent me a tape of the whole thing, which is quite useful.
I'm embarrassed to look at it and see how much of a grilling you actually
Yeah, I had more than I say anyway.
And how much we have to ditch. I mean, there's even more for us.
Yes. Well, don't worry, it doesn't worry me.
Okay.
I know how full my wastepaper basket gets. It's under the same theory.
I'll cue Paul what he can calculate. Hopefully let me know when we're ready. What we're actually going to be doing with this is...
Creates Rowan, so whenever you want.
It's often said that there are more than 6 centuries of English literature. It's not often said that there are less than 2 centuries of English literacy. Of course, English in those two statements means rather different things. The first refers to the language, the second to the people. But then it's the ordinarily unexamined relation between those two meanings, the language and the people, that can be a central problem in English studies. I did it without reading that time, so it's not quite according to the text. Never mind, it's my own text.
It's in the right order anyway, that's the main thing. Thanks very much indeed.
No, it's been very good. I mean, it's nice to... I'll